A new chapter in Africa's history is unfolding. On June 26, 2025, something quietly extraordinary happened in Burkina Faso. 8 nations, including India, Turkey, Cuba, and even Luxembourg, align not with the West, but with Ibrahim Traoré. Burkina Faso, once dismissed as unstable and poor, is now leading a shift in global power. This is more than a political change, it's the rise of a new African era. But why did the world take notice of Burkina Faso? Let's find out. On June 26, 2025, something profound and unprecedented happened in the capital of Burkina Faso, Ouagadougou. It wasn't a high-profile event marked by global headlines or flashy media coverage, but the significance of this moment would soon be felt across the globe. 8 nations, representing regions from Asia to Europe, quietly arrived at the gates of the presidential palace in a ceremony that would change the course of history. These countries, including India, Turkey, Cuba, and even Luxembourg, were not merely fulfilling diplomatic duties, they were aligning themselves with a new force in Africa, Burkina Faso, under the leadership of Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Burkina Faso, long dismissed as a poor and unstable nation, was now becoming the center of a global shift. The world had expected Africa to remain in the shadows of geopolitical affairs, influenced by foreign powers and their interests. Yet, in this quiet ceremony, history pivoted. These 8 ambassadors did not come just to meet with a military leader, they came to formalize a new chapter. Burkina Faso was no longer a passive player on the global stage, it was now the focal point, and the nations that arrived recognized something Africa had long been denied, the strength, resilience, and sovereignty to stand tall. The global shift was not limited to the arrival of these nations, it was a sign of the changing dynamics of global power. The former colonial powers had long seen Africa as a place to exploit its resources and people. For centuries, Africa's potential was kept in check by imposed borders, divided nations, and external interference. But now, these 8 countries had made a decision to support a new path for Africa, a path of defiance, independence, and unity. What they were signaling was clear, the world's power structure was changing, and it was time to embrace a new vision, led by a nation that had long been marginalized. So, what had changed? Why would nations like India, a global economic powerhouse, and Turkey, with its strategic ambitions, align themselves with a leader once seen as nothing more than a temporary figurehead? The answer lies in what Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré represents. In the face of enormous international pressure, Traoré had made bold decisions that challenged Western norms, refused external interference, and championed African unity. His decision to expel foreign forces, reject international loans, and focus on internal development sent shockwaves around the world. It wasn't just defiance, it was a clear message. Burkina Faso was reclaiming its sovereignty, and in doing so, it was offering Africa a new model for leadership. The ceremony, devoid of fanfare, was symbolic of the approach Traoré had taken throughout his leadership. It was strategic, deliberate, and calm, but its implications would ripple far beyond Burkina Faso. These nations were not just here to sign documents, they were here to acknowledge a shift in the balance of global power. As Traoré's leadership has shown, Africa no longer has to beg for attention. It can demand respect, and now, the world was beginning to listen. India, a nation striving for leadership in the global south, saw Burkina Faso as an ally, someone who could help pave the way for a new partnership based on mutual respect and independence. Turkey, whose policies often tested NATO's boundaries, recognized the parallel in Burkina Faso's stance, rejecting Western interference in favor of building its own future. Cuba, once a beacon of resistance against imperialism, saw in Traoré's leadership a chance to forge a new path of solidarity, not just nostalgia. Even Luxembourg, a small but strategic player in the European Union, understood the changing winds and the importance of adapting to this new global reality. The quiet arrival of these ambassadors was more than just a diplomatic gesture, it was an acknowledgement that the center of global power was beginning to shift. Burkina Faso was no longer isolated. It was no longer a nation struggling to survive under the weight of external control. Instead, it was becoming a beacon for a new kind of leadership, one that refused to bow to the traditional powers that had long dictated the rules. The ceremony, devoid of fanfare, was symbolic of the approach Traoré had taken throughout his leadership. It was strategic, deliberate, and calm, but its implications would ripple far beyond Burkina Faso. These nations were not just here to sign documents, they were here to acknowledge a shift in the balance of global power. As Traoré's leadership has shown, Africa no longer has to beg for attention. It can demand respect, and now, the world was beginning to listen. India, a nation striving for leadership in the global south, saw Burkina Faso as an ally, someone who could help pave the way for a new partnership based on mutual respect and independence. Turkey, whose policies often tested NATO's boundaries, recognized the parallel in Burkina Faso's stance, rejecting Western interference in favor of building its own future. Cuba, once a beacon of resistance against imperialism, saw in Traoré's leadership a chance to forge a new path of solidarity, not just nostalgia. Even Luxembourg, a small but strategic player in the European Union, understood the changing winds and the importance of adapting to this new global reality. The quiet arrival of these ambassadors was more than just a diplomatic gesture, it was an acknowledgement that the center of global power was beginning to shift. Burkina Faso was no longer isolated. It was no longer a nation struggling to survive under the weight of external control. Instead, it was becoming a beacon for a new kind of leadership, one that refused to bow to the traditional powers that had long dictated the rules. The arrival of the 8 ambassadors in Burkina Faso on June 26, 2025, wasn't just a routine diplomatic exchange, it was a turning point in history. These nations, India, Turkey, Cuba, Luxembourg, and others, weren't simply visiting a small, landlocked country in West Africa. They were making a strategic decision to align themselves with Ibrahim Traoré and Burkina Faso's vision of sovereignty, self-reliance, and defiance against Western hegemony. The symbolism of these nations choosing to travel to Ouagadougou at the same time, to participate in the same ceremony, wasn't lost on the world. These countries weren't merely participating in a diplomatic engagement, they were signaling a seismic shift in the global balance of power. The ambassadors didn't come to just shake hands with Traoré, they came to recognize the profound impact his leadership could have on the future of Africa, and in turn, the future of global politics. Burkina Faso's defiance against Western interests, its rejection of foreign aid and loans, and its push for self-sufficiency were not just bold decisions, they were a challenge to the existing world order. As these nations aligned themselves with Traoré, they were acknowledging that the old ways of doing business were no longer effective, and that Africa's future could no longer be dictated by foreign powers. This new alliance was not just about diplomacy, it was about strategy. For India, a country that has long been striving for leadership in the global south, supporting Burkina Faso was a way to deepen its ties with a nation that was boldly rejecting Western influence. India saw Burkina Faso as a potential partner in its efforts to build a more self-sufficient, resilient economy that didn't rely on Western-backed institutions or exploitative practices. For Turkey, the decision to align with Burkina Faso was a clear message. Turkey, under President Erdogan, has been rebranding itself as a global connector, one that doesn't play by Western rules. By supporting Burkina Faso, Turkey was not only reinforcing its own stance against NATO and the European Union but also strengthening its position as a leader of non-aligned nations. The partnership with Burkina Faso, which has rejected Western interference and military presence, was a calculated move to position itself as a force that could stand on equal footing with the Western powers. For Cuba, this alignment was deeply symbolic. Cuba has always been a country that has resisted imperialism, fought for sovereignty, and worked to build alliances based on solidarity, not exploitation. By supporting Burkina Faso, Cuba was signaling that it stood with Africa in its fight for self-determination and independence. It wasn't just about ideological solidarity, it was about practical cooperation. Cuba's expertise in fields like healthcare and biotechnology could be a crucial resource for Burkina Faso as it continues to build its internal capacity. Luxembourg's involvement was perhaps the most surprising. Known for its financial influence and discreet diplomacy, Luxembourg's decision to align with Burkina Faso reflected a recognition of the changing tides in global geopolitics. Luxembourg, traditionally a strong ally of the West, had seen the global order shifting and realized that it could no longer afford to ignore these developments. By supporting Burkina Faso, Luxembourg was signaling its awareness of the emerging global order, one where Africa's voice would no longer be ignored, and where it would take a seat at the table of global decision-making. The quiet yet impactful presence of Luxembourg in Burkina Faso was an acknowledgement that even the smallest of Western nations could no longer deny the growing power of Africa. But it wasn't just these countries that were watching and aligning themselves with Burkina Faso. Across Africa, other nations were beginning to take note of what was happening in Ouagadougou. For decades, African nations had been trapped in a system that required them to follow Western-imposed economic models, trade systems, and political structures. Many countries feared that challenging the West would lead to isolation, sanctions, or worse. But what Burkina Faso's alignment with 8 diverse and powerful nations showed was that defiance could lead to new opportunities, new alliances, and a brighter future for Africa. The ripple effects of this alignment were already beginning to be felt in countries like Mali and Niger, where similar military-led transitions had begun. These nations, which had long been subjected to foreign interference, were now finding their own voices, rejecting the status quo and seeking partnerships with those who understood their desire for autonomy. These countries were no longer willing to be pawns in a geopolitical game controlled by external powers. Burkina Faso, under Traoré's leadership, was showing them that it was possible to stand up to the West, assert their sovereignty, and thrive. This new era of African leadership was not about confrontation for the sake of conflict. It was about building a new reality where Africa was no longer dependent on foreign powers for its survival. It was about creating alliances that were based on mutual respect and shared goals, goals that prioritized Africa's future, not the interests of foreign corporations or governments. The alignment of these 8 nations with Burkina Faso wasn't just about politics, it was a strategic move, a bet on the future. These countries recognized that the old world order was slipping, and by aligning with Burkina Faso, they were positioning themselves to be part of the new, emerging global order, one where Africa would no longer be a passive participant, but an active player shaping its own destiny. In the days following the ceremony, the impact of this shift became clear. Countries that had once been hesitant to step out of the shadow of Western influence were now beginning to reconsider their positions. As Burkina Faso led the charge, it was clear that the entire African continent was on the cusp of a dramatic transformation. And the world was watching closely, wondering how the old powers would respond to this new force rising in Africa. The creation of a unified superstate by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger under Ibrahim Traoré's leadership is not just a political breakthrough, it is a defiant rejection of the colonial legacy that has plagued Africa for centuries. The colonial powers that once divided Africa with arbitrary borders, without regard to the ethnic, cultural, or historical ties of the people, left a lasting imprint on the continent. These borders have been a source of conflict, strife, and division, hindering Africa's progress and growth. But now, these 3 nations are rewriting their own destiny. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have come together to erase the boundaries imposed upon them by foreign powers, effectively rejecting the colonial systems that sought to divide and weaken the continent. This is not just a political move, it is a symbolic gesture to show that Africa will no longer be bound by the constraints of its colonial past. For decades, the world has viewed Africa through the lens of its artificial divisions. These borders were designed to separate the continent's diverse cultures, identities, and histories, often for the benefit of European powers. They were not designed to serve the people of Africa. In fact, they served to perpetuate inequality, instability, and underdevelopment. The consequences of these borders have been devastating: civil wars, territorial disputes, and the fragmentation of societies. But now, in 2025, 3 African nations have decided to tear down the walls that have separated them for over a century. This move is not just about dissolving geographic lines, it is about dismantling the psychological barriers that have kept Africa divided. It is about reclaiming African unity and demonstrating to the world that Africa is capable of standing strong on its own. The defiance of these nations is not only against their colonial past, it is also a direct challenge to the external forces that have long sought to control their future. Burkina Faso's refusal to submit to the dictates of foreign powers, to continue playing the game that was imposed by colonial rulers, is a powerful declaration that Africa is ready to take its place as a leader in the world. The significance of this move cannot be overstated. It is not just a rejection of colonial borders, it is a rejection of the entire colonial mindset that has plagued Africa for centuries. Traoré and his allies are showing the world that Africa no longer needs to seek permission from Western powers to determine its own future. The decision to break down colonial borders and form a unified superstate is a message to the rest of Africa and the world. It is a message that Africa is capable of governing itself, of determining its own path without relying on foreign influence. And it is a message that the time has come for Africa to stop apologizing for its past and to start shaping its own future. This move has been years in the making, as African nations have slowly been waking up to the reality that they no longer need to be dependent on Western powers. Burkina Faso, under Traoré's leadership, has shown that it is possible to break free from the chains of the past and create a future that is defined by African strength, resilience, and unity. The formation of the superstate is not just a political and symbolic victory, it is a demonstration of what Africa can achieve when it comes together. The success of this movement is not just a victory for Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, it is a victory for the entire continent. It is a victory for African sovereignty, African self-reliance, and African unity. The leaders of these 3 nations have shown that it is possible to overcome the divisions of the past and create something new. They have demonstrated that Africa does not have to accept the systems that were imposed upon it. It is possible to rewrite Africa's future, to create a new vision that is rooted in the continent's own history, culture, and values. This is the beginning of a new era for Africa, one in which the continent is no longer a pawn in global power struggles. Africa is now taking control of its own destiny, and the rest of the world is watching. The implications of this movement extend far beyond Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. As other African nations witness the success of this bold step, they will be inspired to follow suit. The idea of African unity is no longer just a dream, it is becoming a reality. The creation of this superstate is a model that other nations may choose to replicate, and in doing so, it will reshape the entire political and economic landscape of Africa. The message is clear: Africa is no longer divided by colonial borders, and the nations that once struggled under the weight of foreign interference are now taking their place as equal players on the global stage. The next step for Africa will be to build on this momentum and expand the vision of unity, self-sufficiency, and independence. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have shown that it is possible to overcome the legacy of colonialism, to tear down the barriers that have divided the continent, and to build a united, prosperous future. This is just the beginning. The formation of the superstate is the first step toward a new African reality, one where the continent stands as a leader in the global arena. And the world will have no choice but to adapt to this new reality, where Africa is no longer an afterthought, but a force to be reckoned with. The formation of the superstate led by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger is more than just a regional shift in Africa, it's the birth of a new global order. The bold actions of these countries, rejecting foreign intervention, expelling colonial-era powers, and asserting sovereignty over their resources, have set a new precedent. This is not just a moment of defiance, it is a statement that the old world order is crumbling. What is unfolding in Africa is a complete overhaul of global political structures, and the rest of the world is beginning to realize that the center of power is moving. As the West grapples with its diminishing influence over Africa, countries like India, Turkey, and even Luxembourg are aligning themselves with the new leadership in Burkina Faso. These nations aren't merely expressing diplomatic support, they are taking calculated steps to position themselves within a new global framework. The global order, dominated by Western powers for centuries, is no longer the only game in town. Burkina Faso's defiance against colonialism and Western hegemony is becoming a beacon for a new kind of leadership, one that is rooted in self-sufficiency, respect for sovereignty, and a commitment to reshaping the way the world interacts with Africa. What is happening in Burkina Faso is more than just the unification of three countries, it's the beginning of a continental shift that has the potential to change the way the entire world does business. Burkina Faso's rise is symbolic of a broader movement in Africa, one where countries are no longer content to be pawns in the geopolitical games of foreign powers. The creation of the superstate is proof that Africa is capable of governing itself, of deciding its own future, and of rejecting the systems that have kept the continent in a state of dependency. It is clear that Africa is no longer content to rely on foreign aid, multinational corporations, or international organizations for its survival. These countries are showing that they are capable of standing on their own, making their own decisions, and building their own economies without interference from outside forces. For too long, the West has dominated global affairs, often at the expense of Africa. Colonial powers divided the continent, exploited its resources, and controlled its political and economic systems. But now, in 2025, Africa is rewriting the rules. This movement is not just about Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, it is about every African nation that is tired of being a subject in the global order. The rise of this superstate is not just about economic independence, it is about political sovereignty. These nations are reclaiming their right to determine their own future without external pressure or influence. The political and economic independence that these countries are asserting is a direct challenge to the existing global power structures. Burkina Faso's rejection of Western influence is not a one-time event, it is the beginning of a movement that will continue to grow. As more African nations see the success of this new model, they will begin to follow suit. The fear of isolation that once held back many African countries from challenging Western dominance is beginning to dissipate. Instead, countries are finding that standing up for their sovereignty is not only possible, it's necessary. The world is watching as Burkina Faso takes the lead. India, with its growing economy and influence in the global south, is already looking at Burkina Faso as a potential partner in its efforts to reshape the global economic order. India's interest in Burkina Faso goes beyond traditional trade relations, it is about building a partnership based on mutual respect and shared interests. India sees in Burkina Faso an ally that is committed to rejecting Western hegemony and building an independent future. Similarly, Turkey, whose political and economic strategies often challenge the status quo, recognizes the potential of Burkina Faso as a partner in reshaping global alliances. Turkey's decision to align with Burkina Faso is not just about supporting a political movement, it's about finding new allies who are willing to work outside of the Western framework. Turkey's partnership with Burkina Faso is an opportunity to build something new, a relationship based on shared sovereignty and self-determination, rather than one based on dependence or colonial legacy. The involvement of Cuba, Luxembourg, and other nations further illustrates the changing dynamics of global politics. Cuba, with its long history of resistance against imperialism, sees in Burkina Faso a kindred spirit, another nation that refuses to bow to foreign powers. Luxembourg's alignment with Burkina Faso is a recognition that Africa is no longer the continent it once was. It's no longer a place to be exploited, it's a place where nations can come together to create new economic opportunities, forge new political alliances, and build a new kind of global order. The success of this superstate is a clear signal that Africa is no longer a passive player in the global game. It is no longer willing to be dictated to or controlled by external forces. Burkina Faso's rise to prominence is the beginning of a new era in African leadership. The superstate is not just about politics, It's about changing the way the world sees Africa. It's about showing that Africa has the power to shape its own future, to stand as an equal on the world stage, and to lead the charge for a new kind of global cooperation. As Burkina Faso's influence grows, the world will have no choice but to adapt to this new reality. This new model of African leadership is one that prioritizes sovereignty, self-sufficiency, and unity. It is a model that rejects the exploitation of Africa's resources and people, and instead focuses on building a future that benefits Africans first and foremost. The creation of this superstate is not just a victory for Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, it is a victory for all of Africa. It is a symbol of what is possible when African nations choose to stand together, to reject foreign dominance, and to build a future that is rooted in their own values, needs, and aspirations. Ibrahim Traoré is not the kind of leader that history typically produces. He didn't come from political elites or the halls of diplomatic power. He rose from the military ranks, becoming a figure who would ultimately challenge the established power structures of Africa and the world. But what makes Traoré so distinctive isn't his military background, it's his unwavering commitment to building a sovereign, independent Africa that refuses to bow to the demands of foreign powers. When Traoré first took power in Burkina Faso, many in the West predicted that his leadership would be short-lived. They assumed he would simply be a transitional figurehead, eventually replaced by a government more palatable to Western interests. But Traoré rejected that narrative, choosing instead to chart his own course. He didn't just remove the colonial scaffolding, he tore it down completely. His leadership style was marked by confidence, decisiveness, and, above all, a refusal to compromise on Burkina Faso's sovereignty. He expelled foreign troops, rejected the influence of Western governments, and cut off foreign aid, actions that many predicted would destabilize the country. Yet, far from destabilizing Burkina Faso, these actions brought the country closer to its people and allowed it to begin building a future on its own terms. Unlike many African leaders, Traoré didn't seek legitimacy through Western channels. He didn't rely on foreign powers to approve his decisions or offer their assistance. Instead, he focused on ensuring that Burkina Faso's sovereignty was in the hands of its people and that the country's resources were used to benefit its citizens, not multinational corporations or foreign governments. This boldness has made Traoré a polarizing figure. To some, he is a symbol of African defiance, standing tall against the West's attempts to control the continent. To others, he represents a risk, a leader who may destabilize the region or alienate Burkina Faso from the international community. But the more the world watches, the more it becomes clear that Traoré's actions are calculated and strategic, not reckless. He is building a vision for the future, one in which Africa is no longer dependent on foreign aid, external intervention, or foreign investment. The foundation of this new Africa is sovereignty, something that has been denied to African nations for centuries. What's perhaps most remarkable about Traoré's leadership is his ability to turn a country once seen as weak and unstable into a beacon for self-reliance and African unity. Burkina Faso is no longer a place for foreign powers to intervene, it is a place where Africa's strength is being realized. Under Traoré, the country is beginning to rebuild its economy, infrastructure, and military capacity. While the West might view these efforts as risky, they are, in fact, a powerful statement of intent. Burkina Faso is choosing to rely on its own resources, its own people, and its own vision for the future. This is what makes Traoré different. He doesn't just talk about change, he implements it. Unlike many leaders who are content to merely pay lip service to African unity, Traoré is actively building it. His decision to form alliances with Mali and Niger is a concrete step toward a united Africa, where countries no longer bow to Western powers, but instead work together to create a strong, independent continent. These alliances are not built on vague ideals or empty promises. They are built on concrete actions, joint defense agreements, economic cooperation, and mutual respect for each nation's sovereignty. By forging these partnerships, Traoré is showing that Africa's future lies in unity, not division. What makes Traoré even more magnetic is the way he operates. Unlike many leaders who rely on rhetoric and diplomatic speeches, Traoré focuses on action. He doesn't preach about the problems facing Africa, he acts to solve them. His efforts to nationalize resources, build industries, and invest in food sovereignty have had a tangible impact on Burkina Faso's development. But perhaps the most important aspect of Traoré's leadership is his confidence. He doesn't apologize for his decisions, he owns them. He isn't afraid to stand up to the West, even when it means facing criticism or isolation. This confidence is contagious. As Burkina Faso strengthens its sovereignty and independence, it becomes a model for other African nations. These nations see in Traoré a leader who is not afraid to challenge the status quo. They see someone who is committed to building a better future for Africa, and they are inspired by his example. The ripple effect of Traoré's leadership is already being felt across the continent. Countries like Mali, Niger, Guinea, and Chad are watching closely, seeing the benefits of defying Western power structures and asserting their own sovereignty. In fact, many African nations are beginning to take cues from Burkina Faso, moving away from dependence on foreign aid and working together to build stronger, self-sufficient economies. But it's not just governments that are taking notice. Traoré's leadership is also resonating with the people of Africa. Young Africans, disillusioned with Western-backed political systems and economic structures, are finding inspiration in his rise to power. His speeches, focused on African dignity, self-reliance, and unity, are being shared across social media, creating a groundswell of support from the continent's youth. These young people, who have long been excluded from the political process, are now finding a voice in Traoré's vision. His leadership is showing them that it is possible to create change from within, to build a future where Africa is no longer at the mercy of foreign powers. Ibrahim Traoré is not just a leader of Burkina Faso, he is becoming a symbol for Africa. He is showing the world that Africa doesn't need to follow the West's model of development, it can create its own. And as more African nations begin to embrace this vision, the question becomes not whether Africa will rise, but when. What Ibrahim Traoré is building in Burkina Faso is more than just a new political regime, it's a blueprint for Africa's future. The model he is establishing is one of true sovereignty, self-sufficiency, and independence. For too long, African nations have been caught in a cycle of dependency, relying on foreign aid, loans, and interventions, often at the cost of their own autonomy. Burkina Faso, under Traoré's leadership, is rejecting this paradigm. The creation of a unified superstate, involving Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, is not just a political unification, it's an economic and cultural revolution. Traoré's vision of self-reliance is rooted in the belief that Africa's resources should serve Africa, not foreign powers. He is not content with simply gaining control of Burkina Faso's economic destiny. He is striving to ensure that Africa, as a whole, reclaims its wealth from the hands of foreign corporations and external interests. One of the primary pillars of Traoré's vision is resource nationalism. For decades, Africa's rich natural resources, gold, uranium, oil, and other critical minerals, have been siphoned off by multinational corporations and foreign governments. The profits from these resources have rarely made their way into the pockets of the African people. Instead, they have gone to wealthy nations and corporations, leaving African countries with little more than environmental damage and social inequality. Traoré's government is changing this dynamic. Burkina Faso is now taking full control over its resources, nationalizing key industries, and using the wealth generated to fund domestic projects. Traoré is not just empowering his own nation, he is sending a message to the rest of Africa that they, too, can take control of their resources and use them to build their own futures. This is a crucial step toward breaking the chains of neo-colonialism. For too long, African nations have been subjected to the whims of foreign investors and corporations. But now, with Traoré at the helm, Burkina Faso is charting its own course. Instead of relying on foreign aid or loans, the country is focused on building its own industries, revamping its agricultural sector, and creating jobs for its people. This shift toward economic independence is part of a broader push for sovereignty, both political and cultural. Traoré has made it clear that Burkina Faso will not be dictated to by foreign powers. He has expelled foreign troops, rejected Western-backed loans, and instead is building a government that is truly accountable to the people. The move toward sovereignty is not just about rejecting external interference, it's about ensuring that the people of Burkina Faso are in control of their own fate. This model is revolutionary because it does not depend on the old systems of Western aid or foreign investment. Instead, it is rooted in a philosophy of self-reliance, economic independence, and collective action. Burkina Faso is taking the lead, but this movement is not limited to one country. The success of Burkina Faso's model could inspire other African nations to follow suit. Mali and Niger have already taken steps in this direction, and other nations across the continent are looking closely at what is happening in Ouagadougou. These nations are seeing that it is possible to break free from the constraints of foreign dependency and build a future based on self-sufficiency. This is not just an economic revolution, it's a cultural one. For generations, Africa has been taught that it cannot stand on its own, that it needs foreign powers to help it thrive. The narrative has been that Africa's resources are too valuable to be controlled by Africans, that without the expertise and capital of foreign powers, Africa cannot succeed. But what Traoré is proving is that Africa can thrive without the West. He is showing the world that Africa has the potential to build its own industries, to control its own resources, and to chart its own course. This model of self-reliance is not just a one-time success, it is a replicable vision for Africa's future. The success of Burkina Faso will not be measured by its ability to maintain power within its borders alone, it will be measured by the ripple effects that it sends across the continent. As more nations begin to look to Burkina Faso's example, they will see that it is possible to stand up to the West, to reclaim control over their resources, and to build a future based on their own vision. The ultimate goal of this movement is African unity. By uniting Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger under one banner, Traoré is sending a clear message to the rest of Africa: the continent is stronger together than apart. This unity will be key to Africa's future success. As more African nations come together, pooling their resources, sharing knowledge, and building collective strength, the continent will be able to take its rightful place on the global stage. The vision that Traoré is building is not just about his own country, it is about Africa as a whole. The ultimate goal is to create a united Africa that is self-sufficient, economically independent, and politically sovereign. This vision is already beginning to take shape. Other nations, like Mali and Niger, are following Burkina Faso's lead and rejecting foreign interference. As more nations join this movement, the dream of a united and self-sufficient Africa will become a reality. But this process will not be easy. The forces that have long controlled Africa's resources will not give up their power without a fight. There will be resistance, both from external forces and from within the continent. But as Burkina Faso's success shows, there is no turning back. Africa is ready to take control of its future, and it is no longer willing to wait for permission. Burkina Faso is leading the charge, and the rest of the continent is watching. The future of Africa is being built on the foundations of sovereignty, unity, and self-reliance. As more nations embrace this model, Africa will rise to its rightful place as a global leader. The rise of the superstate led by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger is more than just a regional shift, it signals the birth of a new Africa. An Africa that no longer seeks validation from foreign powers, but instead defines its own future. The creation of this superstate is not simply a political move, but the beginning of a profound transformation that will shape the continent's destiny for generations to come. For too long, Africa has been viewed as a continent that is dependent on aid, intervention, and the influence of foreign powers. The West, and to some extent China and Russia, have long used Africa's resources and strategic importance for their own benefit. In return, African nations were left with little control over their own futures. But this new movement, spearheaded by Burkina Faso, is showing the world that Africa is ready to stand on its own. It is not a continent to be ignored, nor one to be exploited. It is a continent that is rewriting its own rules. What these three nations are doing is more than just rejecting foreign influence. They are asserting a new model of African self-sufficiency, one where the continent relies on its own resources, its own people, and its own willpower. The superstate isn't just a political union, it's a vision of Africa as a powerful, united force capable of standing shoulder to shoulder with the world's most powerful nations. This new reality is not just about politics, it's about changing the very way the world perceives Africa. For too long, Africa was seen as a place of poverty, instability, and violence. Western media often portrayed the continent as a disaster zone, needing constant intervention and aid. But under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso is challenging this perception. He is showing the world that Africa can solve its own problems, without foreign interference, and that it is capable of charting its own course. The unity formed between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger is just the beginning. Other African nations are beginning to take notice, and many are considering whether they too can follow in Burkina Faso's footsteps. As more nations join the movement for African unity and self-sufficiency, the continent will grow stronger, more self-reliant, and more politically powerful. The implications of this shift are far-reaching. The world is watching closely, and the reactions are mixed. The West is uncomfortable with this new direction, as it undermines its control over the continent's resources and political decisions. But Africa's rise isn't about antagonizing the West, it's about creating an Africa that stands on its own, where its people decide its future, not foreign powers. The future of Africa is in its own hands, and the creation of this superstate is proof of that. The success of this experiment in unity is being closely watched by other African nations that have long been stuck in the web of foreign aid, debt traps, and political instability. These countries are now beginning to see that it is possible to reject the old way of doing things, to break free from the chains of colonialism and the influence of foreign powers, and build a new, independent future. Burkina Faso's leadership is showing that the African continent can overcome its challenges on its own terms, without depending on foreign assistance or intervention. This vision is spreading. Already, Mali and Niger have followed Burkina Faso's lead in rejecting foreign interference, asserting their sovereignty, and beginning to build stronger, more self-sufficient economies. The creation of the superstate is not just about these three countries, it's a model for the entire continent. As other African nations observe the success of this movement, they are beginning to understand that Africa's true power lies in its unity and its ability to control its own destiny. The most powerful thing about this new vision is not just that it's happening, but that it's working. Burkina Faso's success shows that it is possible for Africa to thrive without foreign aid, without foreign military intervention, and without the influence of Western powers. The continent can build its own economy, control its own resources, and shape its own future. The ripple effects of this movement are already being felt. Other African countries, many of which have long been caught in the web of foreign influence, are now re-evaluating their own political and economic strategies. Some are beginning to distance themselves from the West, while others are looking to form stronger partnerships within Africa. The success of the Burkina Faso-led superstate is giving these countries hope that they, too, can build a future that is not dictated by foreign interests. The future of Africa is no longer about following the West's model. It's about creating a new model, one that reflects the continent's own values, its own priorities, and its own vision for the future. The rise of the superstate is just the beginning. As more African nations choose unity and self-reliance, the world will have to adjust. The old power structures that have dominated global politics for centuries will have to adapt to this new reality. Africa is no longer a passive player in global affairs. It is a continent that is taking control of its own future, and the rest of the world will have to recognize its power. The creation of the superstate is not just about politics, it is about Africa's rise as a self-sufficient, united, and powerful continent. It is a symbol of what can be achieved when African nations come together and reject foreign domination. And as the superstate grows and more countries join the movement, the impact will be felt across the globe. Africa is ready to rise, and this superstate is the first step in a new era for the continent. The world is watching, and the question is no longer whether Africa will rise, but when, and how high it will go. The rise of Burkina Faso, and its transformation into the central hub of a united Africa, is nothing short of revolutionary. However, this bold shift has not gone unnoticed by the powers that have historically dominated the global landscape, especially the West. The European powers, and particularly the United States, have long maintained a tight grip over Africa's resources and political influence, with the continent often treated as a pawn in larger geopolitical games. The rise of Burkina Faso as an assertive, self-reliant nation has sent shockwaves through Western capitals, and the response has been swift, though not entirely overt. The West has spent decades positioning itself as the central authority in Africa, using tools like foreign aid, military interventions, and trade deals to ensure its interests were met. Now, as African nations like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger break free from these chains, the old guard is beginning to feel the loss of control. The West's primary reaction is one of discomfort. The fear is palpable, as Western nations are unsure of how to deal with this emerging Africa, an Africa that is rejecting the systems that have allowed the West to thrive. For years, African nations have been the recipients of Western-dominated aid systems, often with strings attached. These nations have been caught in a cycle of dependency, reliant on foreign loans, aid, and military intervention to maintain stability. But now, as Burkina Faso rejects these structures and leads by example, the West's grip on the continent is slipping. The most significant form of resistance from the West has been through economic pressures, diplomatic isolation, and attempts at media manipulation. Stories about instability, authoritarianism, and even extremism in Burkina Faso have been amplified in Western news outlets. These portrayals are not designed to inform, but to frame the narrative in a way that discredits the new model of leadership emerging in Africa. Burkina Faso is being labeled as reckless, dangerous, and even a threat to the international order. This is a common tactic used by Western powers when faced with a challenge to their dominance. By framing the leadership in Burkina Faso as unstable or authoritarian, the West is attempting to undermine the legitimacy of Traoré's government and its vision for a new, independent Africa. But despite these efforts, the growing influence of Burkina Faso and its allies is undeniable. The more the West resists, the more the African continent embraces this new vision of sovereignty and independence. The rise of Burkina Faso has revealed a deeper truth: Africa is no longer willing to accept the narrative dictated by the West. It is creating its own story. As the superstate grows stronger, the fear among Western powers increases. Burkina Faso, once seen as a pawn in geopolitical games, is now emerging as a central player. The success of this model is becoming a challenge for the old powers, as they realize that Africa may no longer be a continent they can easily control or manipulate. The fear is not just about losing access to resources, it is about losing the ability to shape Africa's future. But while the West is focused on resisting change, the rest of the world is watching. India, Turkey, Cuba, and other nations that have aligned with Burkina Faso are not doing so out of mere sentiment. They are recognizing a shift in global power dynamics and making a strategic decision to align with the future. The world is changing, and those who are quick to adapt will reap the rewards. The West's resistance is not just a response to the actions of Burkina Faso, it is a reflection of its discomfort with a changing world order. The old world order, where power was concentrated in the hands of a few nations, is being replaced by a more multipolar world, where emerging nations like India, Turkey, and Burkina Faso are becoming key players. The response from the West will continue to be one of resistance, but it will also be one of adaptation. The West has no choice but to acknowledge that Africa's rise is inevitable. The question now is not whether Africa will succeed, but how the West will respond to this new reality. The more the West attempts to isolate and undermine Burkina Faso and its allies, the more Africa will be galvanized. The desire for sovereignty, unity, and self-reliance is strong, and it is no longer something that can be easily suppressed by economic sanctions or diplomatic isolation. The true power of Africa lies in its unity, and Burkina Faso is leading the charge in uniting the continent. The creation of the superstate is not just a political victory for Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, it is a victory for all of Africa. It is a statement that Africa will no longer be divided by external forces, and that the continent has the strength to stand on its own. The West's attempts to discredit and resist the rise of Africa will only accelerate the momentum for change. As more African nations begin to follow in Burkina Faso's footsteps, the world will have to come to terms with the fact that Africa is no longer a passive participant in global affairs. It is an active, unified force that is shaping its own future. The success of Burkina Faso is a signal to the rest of the world that Africa's time has come. No longer will the continent be ignored, manipulated, or dismissed. Burkina Faso has shown that the old ways of doing business are no longer acceptable, and Africa is ready to take its rightful place at the table of global powers. The rise of Burkina Faso as a beacon of African unity and sovereignty is not just a victory for the nation itself, it is a victory for the entire continent. The creation of the superstate, uniting Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, is a bold statement that Africa is no longer a passive player on the world stage. This is not merely a political shift, it is the birth of a new African identity, one where the continent's nations stand together, assert their sovereignty, and build a future independent of the old world order. For too long, Africa has been subjected to the whims of foreign powers, whether through economic exploitation, military interventions, or political manipulation. The West, in particular, has viewed Africa as a resource to be extracted and controlled, with little regard for the well-being of its people. Africa's resources, from oil and minerals to agricultural wealth, have been siphoned off by foreign corporations, and its people have often been left to suffer the consequences. But what is happening in Burkina Faso, under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, is a paradigm shift. The creation of the superstate marks the beginning of a new chapter in Africa's history, one where the continent controls its own resources, determines its own policies, and shapes its own future. This is a future where Africa is no longer bound by the limitations imposed by colonial powers, where African nations work together to solve their problems, and where Africa's voice is heard and respected on the global stage. The success of Burkina Faso's experiment in self-reliance, sovereignty, and unity is not just significant for these three countries, it is a model for the entire continent. As more African nations look to Burkina Faso's example, they are realizing that they, too, can reject the status quo and build a future that serves their people, not foreign interests. The ripple effects of this movement are already being felt. Countries like Mali, Niger, and Guinea are already taking steps to assert their sovereignty and build stronger, more self-sufficient economies. These nations are no longer content with being pawns in a geopolitical game controlled by foreign powers. They are reclaiming their autonomy and building alliances that prioritize African interests over those of the West. The creation of this superstate is not just a political shift, it is an economic one as well. The model of self-sufficiency, resource control, and local development that Burkina Faso is implementing is showing that Africa can thrive without the need for foreign aid, loans, or military intervention. This is a model that focuses on the people, on creating jobs, building infrastructure, and ensuring that the wealth generated by Africa's resources stays within the continent. The vision of a self-sufficient Africa is not just an abstract idea, it is a reality that is being built right now. It is a reality that prioritizes local industries, agricultural production, and energy independence. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are not just relying on foreign investment, they are investing in themselves, building their own industries, and creating jobs for their people. This shift away from dependency on foreign powers is not just about economic growth, it is about dignity. For too long, African nations have been told that they cannot succeed without Western help. But Traoré and his allies are showing that Africa has the resources, the people, and the talent to succeed on its own. This is a fundamental shift in how Africa sees itself and how the world sees Africa. The West may resist this shift, but it is becoming increasingly clear that Africa no longer needs to follow the Western model. Instead, Africa is building its own path, and that path is one of self-reliance, strength, and unity. The rise of Burkina Faso and its allies is a direct challenge to the West's dominance. The West has spent centuries shaping Africa to fit its interests, but now Africa is shaping its own future. The superstate of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger is just the beginning. The rest of Africa is watching, and the momentum for change is growing. The world is on the brink of a new African reality, one where the continent's nations stand together as equals on the global stage. This is not just about politics or economics, it is about Africa's dignity and sovereignty. The creation of this superstate is proof that Africa can rise, not as a dependent region, but as a powerful, unified force. And as more African nations follow this path, the future of Africa will be defined by Africans themselves, not by foreign powers. The road ahead will not be easy. There will be challenges, obstacles, and setbacks along the way. But the journey toward African unity, prosperity, and self-sufficiency has already begun, and there is no turning back. The world may resist, but Africa will continue to rise. The question is no longer whether Africa can rise, but when. The creation of this superstate is just the beginning of a new era for Africa. As more countries join the movement, the vision of a united, self-sufficient Africa will become a reality. The future of Africa is bright, and it is in the hands of its people. The West may try to hold on to the old order, but Africa is moving forward, building a future that is its own. This is the dawn of a new African century, and the world will have no choice but to adapt to this new reality. Africa is no longer waiting for permission to rise. It is rising on its own terms, and the rest of the world will have to recognize its power, unity, and strength. The future of Africa is in its hands, and it is a future filled with hope, promise, and limitless potential.